policy briefs for recommendations on foreign policy for the next US president. We timed that to come out just as the debate series was starting and in the conventions, and have carried it through, and it will end on November 3rd, the day before the election. Again, we planned and held briefings in Beijing and Washington just before the Olympics in Beijing, and again in Moscow, Europe, and in Washington we did a whole series of events tied to the Russia-Georgia conflict. Using events to publicize your product is something I guess probably all of us do. Consider the timing of those carefully too. We usually hold ours in our building with a full backdrop showing our key brand as the global think tank, with all the cities spelt out, publications being shown off that are of interest to the audience we get. Crucially, we always bring a fair moderator in, and we have an opposing point of view. If we're doing something particularly controversial, we will make sure we have more than one opposing point of view. There is nothing worse than an agreement of minds. What we want to do is get the debate going properly and then show that our product answers it better for policymakers. But if our audience is the Congress, apart from their staffers being far too busy, they are pretty lazy as well. They will not leave Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., so we have to go to them. A couple of years ago, we recognized that the policy debate on Capitol Hill on China was ridiculously shallow. So we set about pulling in all the best China experts from all the think tanks in Washington, and we took them to a series of debates on the Hill. Those debates turned out to be a sellout, and they're now still one of our biggest products on the web. We recorded them all in audio and video and put the transcripts up, and they're bringing a huge return. We'll have to wait until after the election to see if the China debate on the Hill has actually got any better as a result, but it is a crucial factor. When your audience is too busy, find a way to go to them if they can't come to you. And of course, put your work out through the media by all means, but also via the web. But put your audience first in whatever way you communicate. Effective summaries, tie them to the news cycle, one-on-one briefings where you can. Make sure it's in plain English and not Olympian language that scholars are too fond of. Our audiences are also changing their habits for getting information, so we must change our habits for disseminating it. As Pew Research recently reported, today it's not a choice between traditional sources and the internet for the core elements of today's news audiences, but integrators, the people you and I are both chasing, get both from traditional sources and the internet. The much heralded demise of the mainstream media, it has to be recognized, has not happened and will not happen for quite some time. Although audiences, and therefore advertising revenues for traditional sources of news and information have declined, people are still using a variety of sources for their information. The rival user-driven sites, those that all of us can go on to, Yahoo, Reddit, Dig, Delicious, where you can go on and say, this is the information I want to get, are growing huge, but they tend to be focusing, they tend to be focusing on lifestyle stories such as the latest product from Apple. They're not, by and large, the key audience driver for the information that we want to put out. Some of them will become important for our products in the future, and we need to keep an eye as to which ones are going to get better and better and actually grow a trust base, and then we will start putting our information on them. But most of our audiences, busy policymakers and influencers, want serious information, and for now they find the proliferation of web-based content overwhelming, lacking in trust and lacking in quality. So we must maintain outreach to traditional sources of information, and those sources know their future lies in the fact that they still need sources of honest, accurate analysis that they can trust, which is what we provide them with. So to meet their needs, we continue to conduct traditional outreach to serious print and broadcast media outlets, giving interviews, briefings, writing op-eds, providing transcripts and hard copies of our product, as all route maps to the substantive body of our work. But the internet will increasingly become the main source of this information, eventually, as quality go-to sites establish credibility. So we must develop electronic copies of everything we do. We must post audio and video of our events where we can afford to. And apart from meeting future needs and projecting material to greater numbers all over the world, these electronic documents are so much cheaper. They don't involve so much design, production, or mailing, and quite often you can hire one person or contract out all of those disciplines to one person for an electronic product. But also consider becoming bilingual. Consider going what your product is, who are you trying to reach with it. When we do our Middle East research, there are people interested in Moscow, in Washington, in Brussels. We're translating everything we do. Add state-of-the-art search mechanisms. Make sure people can find your work if you're on the website. Use flash video, audio, new design, anything, and simple classification of your material, anything to make sure that people can find your work easily. But it is worth noting that our biggest website hit of the last 2 years came when we obtained and posted the first and only video of the Andijan massacre. The New York Times, as a result, ran our URL on the front page of the paper, and there we go. The statistics are huge. So the old media still have their influence. We're also maximizing the way we are found on the web, and I would suggest everybody else do too. One of the sites that is getting some recognition as a trusted and quality source is Google Scholar. Google have begun, I hope you've all heard of it, have begun this way of classifying globally all scholarly work. And we, so far, in the last few months, have signed up to over 2,000 of our papers to that site. It's free, it's effective, and it's easy. It will become a go-to site. Blogs are important to different groups for different reasons. In the United States, they're crucial politically, but they're not important for our level of work yet. They're probably the most influential sources of information in the Middle East. So when we come to relaunching our Arab Reform Bulletin recently, or putting out any of our other material in the Middle East, that's the route we'll use. Yet in the United States, few of the important policymakers we're trying to reach have the time to read blogs. They're far from mainstream, and in 2004, the first-year Technorati, who monitor and log all the blogs, issued a State of the Blogosphere report. Then they said the company was tracking 4 million blogs 4 years ago. By October 2005, that number was 19.6 million blogs. Between 2 and 8% of all blogs created daily are now judged to be fake or spam. In April of 2007, the number had risen from 19.6 million to 70 million blogs. And today the number is 133 million blogs worldwide, and those are only the ones that have been indexed. So the number has doubled in almost the last year. Of those 133 million blogs, Technorati says that in the last 7 days, guess how many have been updated? 1.1% of them. That's about 1.5 million in total globally. Fewer than the number of people who attended Minnesota State Fair. And no, I've never been there either. So be careful. There are important blogs out there. They're important in the Middle East. They're important, and they're a cheap way to influence an audience. But make sure your audience, again by asking them, is reading them. You want to target blogs, have a reason to do so. There's no point in spending a lot of time creating a blog. They are very labor intensive, and they can be very controversial and do damage to your subject as well as your institution if you're not sure that your audience is going there. There are other ways, if you have the money, of reaching audiences beyond your borders. We've recently installed video conferencing in all our centres, and it is very cheap. The initial outlay is not. It's extremely expensive, but once you have it, it is extremely cheap to use because you can actually base it through the internet. We still do teleconference calls, bringing in our people from Moscow when something like Russia, Georgia happens, to inform people what's going on there, and vice versa in Europe and the Middle East and everywhere else. It's still a remarkably cheap way to communicate. When you're looking at resources such as video conferencing and teleconferencing, you have to think very carefully about what you want to do. Do you want a big blast of publicity immediately, or do you want a steady flow? Make sure you give yourself targets and a timetable. Periodicals, some of the ones I target, need a story or a feature months in advance before it will appear. So if your strategy is to spread the word through holding a series of briefings, for example, set yourself a target over a specified period. If you wish to go beyond national borders but don't have the resources, strike up partnerships. Each method or way of communicating you've identified will have its own time restraint or limits, so begin to plan early, and begin that plan when you're beginning to write. What's all this going to cost you? In an ideal world, the budget we all have would simply be set at what it costs to implement a strategy, but as NGOs we know we don't have the luxury, and we have to narrow the options. Promise only what you can deliver, use your resources and timescales to set legitimate levels of expectations, and build a case for more detailed resources. None of us can afford to do it all, so target your resources at the methods you think will be more effective, again by asking your audiences. And sometimes these will not be the most glamorous ones or the trendy ones. And as you develop your strategy again, when you begin to write, try and bring in donors to fund both your work and the communications afterwards. Funders are far more likely to give for a particular event or policy brief if it's clearly part of a strategy with a desired goal, rather than an item that stands on its own. communications can be as expensive or cheap as you want them to be. Carnegie's a pretty big name in the think tank world, but we're smaller in both number of scholars and our communication effort than most of our peers in the United States. We spend about 5% of our overall budget on communications. That's a team of 9 people, including me. My team in the Foreign Office, 900 globally. There's the difference. Our peers in Washington, most of them spend 2 or 3 times what we do. Center American Progress, for example, tops the list, spending 40% of its budget with a staff of over 50 people on communications alone. But trust me, size isn't everything. Our surveying has showed that the big spenders are not the most influential. All of us can punch as hard as they do, and occasionally harder they do, by playing smart. How are we playing smart? Smart hiring. We're only taking the best scholars we can find, and we don't pay half as much as some of the next people do. But again, it's the quality of the institution they want to be with and whether we can get their information out. Slots in Carnegie remain vacant for years if we can't find the right person. We don't fill it for the sake of filling it. Smart planning. We have an annual policy planning meeting where our management group, of which I'm a member, sits down with every single scholar to agree a workload that is new, practical, and distinctive from all the others. But also, more important than anything else, it is outcome in its focus. It is outcomes-based. We're not looking for a process or a product necessarily, but we want to know what is the outcome at the end of that year. Who is it you will have influenced and why? And smart communication. We target our outreach carefully. We use the full range of up-to-date, attractive tools, and we don't waste people's time. We do not send email after email or publication after publication unless we know our audience want it. We know our audience as well. So finally, evaluation and amendment. The least enjoyable but most important part of communications work is evaluation. It's a necessary part of evolving a strategy, and there are many benchmarks you can use to do it. For example, recording media appearances or citations. We do that on a daily basis and comparing them to our peers. But again, you cannot beat surveys, whether informal or formal. Objective and independent, they must be as much as you can make them. They're the most effective way to achieve this. As a result, communication strategies must remain fluid, changing over time. Take account of your work as it changes and develops, the varying needs of your various audiences, and events as they happen in the real world. That way you can ensure that you know yourself well and you also know your audience better. So I'll stop there and go to Q&A, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for, as you said, this brief half-an-hour input, because no other person than President should speak more than half an hour. That was in our briefing. I hope that you have questions regarding what Peter just presented on general level, but I also encourage you and invite you to ask questions which are related to your own worries and your own communication strategies back in your think tanks. So the floor is open. We have a fair amount of time for questions and answers.